Okay, so let's start a discussion with the understanding of the middle way of consumption, the happy medium between parsimony and extravagance. Right. So if we divide consumption pattern very roughly, okay, into two categories, one is extravagant and the other is parsimony. The former represents obviously spending too much, right? Spending much more than necessary. But the later represents spending way below the proper level. In the Book of Rites, Confucius approved neither of them. And he used two examples to explain his point. Extravagant consumption pattern is represented by Guanzhong. Guanzhong. Okay, Guanzhong served as the chancellor of the state of Qi during the spring and autumn period, and was a very successful reformer, and he helped the state of Qi to become the economic superpower of the time. Guanzhong also had an extravagant lifestyle. Now, Confucius described that despite of his position as a great officer, Guanzhong had quite a lifestyle. He said he had carving on the square vessels for holding the grain of his offerings and red ornaments for his cap. He set up a screen where he lodged on the way and had a stand of earth on which the cups he had used in giving a feast were replaced. He had hills carved on the capitals of his pillars and pondweed on the lower pillars supporting the rafters. So Confucius admitted that Guanzhong was a very worthy officer, but it takes some effort for his superiors to distinguish themselves from Guanzhong. Confucius wasn't condemning his lifestyle itself, but he pointed out that the social consequence of Guanzhong's lifestyle was questionable. For the society to be in a harmonious state, it is important for different social classes or groups of people to find their place. Now, this involves having the right consumption pattern. From previous lectures, we know that consumption pattern should fit with social positions so that it creates order, respect, and prevents usurpation. This is not only recognized by the Confucians in China, but also the British economists such as Nassau William Senior in the 19th century. So, from the pattern of consumption, according to Confucius, it seems rather difficult to distinguish who is Guanzhong, a great officer, and who is the king. Because such a lifestyle confuses people. And more importantly, it triggers a social tendency of valuing material above honor. Confucius also illustrated an overly parsimonious lifestyle with using the example of Yan Pingzhong. Yan Pingzhong was a successful diplomat of Qi, the state of Qi, during the late spring and autumn period. Confucius said during the ancestral remembrance ceremony, he used only very limited or very little sacrifice. There was not nearly enough to cover the size of the dish. Again, Confucius gave great credit to this person, to his intellectual ability, but also recognized that his overly strict lifestyle put extreme pressure on his subordinates. So, from a social perspective, this is also unproductive. Although consumption is arguably, a personal choice, a superior man considers the social impact and externality as well as personal choice. Confucius said a superior man would not encroach on the observances of those above him, nor put difficulties in the way of those below him. In other words, conditional on personal financial ability, consumption should follow the rule of moderation or the middle way, at least under the circumstances where there are obvious social impact. So this is why the system of rights is important, and it must be carefully considered. I mean, after all, we're not living in the jungle. We're on our own. We're responsible about what we do and the consequential social impact. Confucius reminded us that the system of rights is of great flexibility and must adapt to different situations. So the appropriate level of rights is a relative term. And, there is always an optimal level given the situation, and any deviation from the optimal would be inferior. So to illustrate this point, we need to introduce another important concept in the theory of consumption in Confucianism, and this is the distinction between self-spending and social spending. So let's take a look. Now, from the surface, social self-spending is for one's own pleasure and need, while social spending is for the greater good of the society around us. Confucius illustrated the difference between self-spending and social spending and his preference using the example of Emperor Yu. He said, "I can find no flaw in the character of Yu. He used coarse food and drink himself, but displayed the utmost filial piety towards the spirits. His ordinary garments were poor, but he displayed the utmost elegance in his sacrificial cap and apron. He lived in a low, mean house, but expended all his strength on the ditches and water channels. I can find nothing like a flaw in you." Well, let's examine this paragraph from different angles. Now, first of all, in terms of personal food consumption, Emperor Yu kept it at the minimum quality, right? It was just enough to prevent hunger, and there was nothing of fancy style. However, during the occasion of ceremony of the spirit, Emperor Yu spared no expense and made sure that the offering was of the highest quality. It wasn't for parading his wealth at all. Ceremony of the spirit was important for the education and unity of the society. So as a way to spread benefit to the wider public, Emperor Yu was very generous. And this is, in contrast to his own consumption. Emperor Yu also set a very low standard for his own personal clothes consumption. He put on low-quality garments for himself during normal times, and yet he kept his most elegant clothes and adornment for sacrificial ceremony. Also, Emperor Yu was very well known for his efforts and achievement in flood management. He was a leader in public projects and the projects that prevented flood by water control. Now, even for modern society, we know that flood management is no easy task. In fact, Emperor Yu spent 13 years living in the wild with the people. He studied the landform and eventually diverted flood into the main rivers and ocean. So, in contrast to his selflessness in public welfare, he chose a very small house for himself for accommodation. Now, we can see that, food, clothes, and shelter, what are they? Well, they are three necessities of life, aren't they? If we take them to test the character of Emperor Yu, we may conclude that his standard is low. But Confucius applauds it. What's the reason for that? Well, it's because when judging Yu from the viewpoint of social expenditure, such as infrastructure, public work, religious sacrifices, Yu was very liberal, and he set a great example for the society. So this is why Confucius said, I can find nothing like a flaw in Yu. So we can see that the system of rites is not a rigid one at all. It serves different purposes on different occasions. For the self, a careful and measured consumption style can keep our growing desire under control. Now, this helps us to maintain stability in the mind. Now, in contrast, a good public welfare is essential to maintain social order and harmony. Therefore, the money and energy spent in this area should be made adequate to the need of the people.